In Part 1, Al Jazeera's investigative unit examined how a former intelligence officer made billions of dollars from corrupt energy deals approved by the Egyptian state. Now we reveal how the legacy of corruption has so damaged Egypt's energy sector that it stands to become dependent on Israel.
Egypt mismanaged its gas industry. It raises the possibility that Israel, in contradiction to the history of the energy relations, will be supplying Egypt.
These are the men who have devastated Egypt's energy industry. Their story is closely linked to the most important relationship in the Middle East, Egypt's peace accord with Israel. It is a story that has now come full circle. The former field marshal, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, won a largely ceremonial presidential poll. The elected leader that Sisi overthrew in a military coup, Mohamed Morsi, remains in jail. Sisi's victory has quashed the Arab Spring while protecting the peace accords with Israel.
I think now, with the return of Sisi and the return of order, I think we see now the spring. We really do.
He's attractive because he's not Morsi. And the concern has always been to maintain and sustain the relationship between Egypt and Israel.
When the Arab Spring swept Egypt, a major motivator, largely ignored by the West, was the unleashing of anger against the government's policies towards Israel, especially the energy deals involving Salem and Maimon.
One of the reasons, I think, for the revolution of 2011, the issue of selling the Egyptian gas at low prices to Israel. It was one of the issues that were highlighted all over Tahrir Square, and many felt betrayal.
Almost any Egyptian that I mention my work to says, why did we export the gas to the Israelis, given what they are doing to Palestinians? And why did we export it to them in 2009 during Operation Cast Lead? The electricity that powered that invasion was in large part supplied by Egypt. Subsidized Egyptian fuel was underwriting the Israeli attack on Gaza. Now, when Egyptians realize that, they're like, what?
Mubarak was ousted by a wide coalition of demonstrators with the acquiescence of Egypt's military, itself threatened by the Mubarak regime's corruption. As the armed forces assumed temporary control, EMG was still using the pipeline to send gas to Israel, even though Salem, its founder, had fled.
Hossein Salem, cleverly enough, had absconded within days of the 2011 revolution starting and run off with a load of money in his bags.
Anger at the EMG deal prompted frequent attacks on the pipeline carrying the gas to Israel. More than a dozen bombings brought the flow to a halt. In April 2012, the Egyptian army intervened.
The military was trying to kind of send a sort of olive branch to the revolutionaries by at least temporarily halting those gas sales and canceling that contract.
But the decision to close the pipeline would have far-reaching consequences. Israel had insisted the EMG contract contain a clause obligating Egypt to provide a continuous and uninterrupted supply of gas for 15 years. That promise allowed the EMG directors to protect their own profits. So by abruptly breaching the contract, the military set off the legal equivalent of a ticking bomb.
The supply contract underlying the gas exports included specific references that if the investments of EMG and the profit-making possibilities of EMG were threatened, then EMG would be able to go to the International Chamber of Commerce and to use their International Court of Arbitration to seek compensation.
Shortly after the pipeline was shut, Yossi Maimon launched a barrage of legal proceedings against the Egyptian government at various international courts. With allegations of corruption surrounding Salem, Maimon is now steering the legal action on behalf of EMG shareholders. These arbitration forums tend to serve the interests of multinational corporations.
When you go to International Court of Arbitration, companies almost always win. which means that if Egypt loses, which is highly likely, then Egypt's resources can basically be confiscated in other countries. EMG can say, well, we want that, we'll take this, that's worth 500 million, we'll take that, that's worth $1 billion, we'll take that, that's worth $1 billion.
EMG has filed 4 separate actions at arbitration courts, including the World Bank. These cases are pending, and the sums involved are so huge that, in theory, they could bankrupt the Egyptian state.
What they've asked for is $8 billion. Hossein Salem has already walked away with $4 billion. And now the investing companies want compensation for another $8 billion because that's what they say they would have made in profit in the next years. Egypt's treasury has around $14 billion of foreign reserves. $8 billion, that's more than half of Egypt's total foreign reserves that it's currently using to just about keep ticking over. And all of this is because of a corrupt deal that was signed to basically support 2 dodgy businessmen, an Israeli one and an Egyptian one, to siphon off public wealth and distribute it among certain elite characters.
Well, we tried to get an interview.
I asked Yossi Maiman to explain EMG's intentions.
We want to ask you have massive cases against the Egyptian government.
It is.
How much money? $8 billion is at stake. How much money will you be satisfied to take from the Egyptians?
I'll settle for $50 billion. Have a good day.
By the summer of 2014, Egypt's energy sector is in a full-blown crisis. Years of corruption have destroyed its relations with global energy companies.
The Egyptian government admits that it owes the foreign companies as much as $6 billion US. So this is not very enticing for foreign investors. So Egypt has big difficulties in attracting foreign capital.
And the problems don't end there. In addition to EMG's lawsuit, there is another $6 billion claim levied against Egypt, this time by the Spanish energy giant Union Fenosa. It claims Egypt has been unable to supply the necessary gas to continue running its plants on the Egyptian coast. So just from the known debts and legal cases, that means the Egyptian state is facing liabilities of a staggering $20 billion. While decades of crooked deals had undermined Egypt's energy sector, a presidential candidate was emerging who pledged to clean up the industry. In the shadow of the military, the Muslim Brotherhood candidate, Mohamed Morsi, won the country's first free election. Back in Washington, policymakers began to reconsider their promotion of democracy in the Middle East.
Western-style democracy, as we see it as essential, doesn't really quite fit the mold over there. There's a veneer of people within the region who've been educated in the West who accept those values, but the overwhelming part of society does not.
The Muslim Brotherhood is pretty solid reputation for not being highly sympathetic to the West, and particularly not to the United States. So it was not really in our interest to see them succeed.
An Islamic-leaning government also sounded the alarm in Tel Aviv.
What do they have to do with democracy? God knows. And this almost stupidity to bring Western values into a country which is fully Islamic, many of which are poor, fundamental Islams, is ridiculous.
The way the new situation in Egypt was analyzed in Israel was there are 2 sources of power. There is the government of Morsi, which is unfriendly to the Israeli interests, and there was the military establishment, which was seen as a possible partner.
Morsi's attempt to confront the rampant corruption in the energy sector coincided with the trial of the former Minister of Petroleum, Sami Fahmy, along with EMG founder Hossein Salem, who was in exile in Spain. Each was sentenced to 15 years for their roles in selling natural gas to Israel at below market rates. In terms of fighting energy corruption, that was about as far as it would go. Assisting the president was Hatem Azam. He was not from the Muslim Brotherhood, but brought with him decades of experience in the oil and gas industry.
President Morsi was facing a lot of pressure with this network of corruption that exists in the intelligence, in the military, This energy corruption network was one of the strongest reasons why the leaders, the army generals, decided to make the coup over Morsi.
The energy sector was also to play a central role in staging the coup. Suddenly, there were shortages.
We saw massive lines in petrol stations throughout the country. We also saw electricity cuts and shortages.
The propaganda machine that was basically saying that Morsi is behind all this. He is behind the gas cuts. His election was bad luck, and see what's happening to the energy.
Only later would clear evidence emerge of the military's deliberate actions to spark public unrest.
The Egyptian military used the supply of gasoline and the gas station as a weapon to throw off Morsi. One day after the coup, all these queues have disappeared and everything goes back to normal.
Voila, you see all these local TV stations saying that, see, the brilliance of al-Sisi has resolved this in no time and so on.
After the army ousted Morsi, much of the world viewed events in Egypt with horror. The military, then led by General Sisi, had overthrown a democratically elected president and crushed the party that he belonged to.
You had the worst massacre in Egypt's modern history happening under Sisi, when you kill more than 1,000 people in less than 7 hours.
The United States was critical of the bloodshed, but stopped short of withdrawing support for the regime.
They were very careful not to say it was a coup. So, and if you look back at the statements and so on, sort of used every euphemism they could except coup. So it was not a coup. Let's get that straight.
It isn't just having elections, that's wonderful, but what comes after the election? If there's not a framework for making government work to accomplish things, then it's very hollow.
The lack of real democracy has allowed the Egyptian military's partnership with Israel to prosper without any public accountability. That includes the nature of President Sisi's contacts with Tel Aviv.
There was very clear, close coordination between the Egyptian military, led by Sisi, and Israeli officials at the highest levels in order to ensure a rapid transition to the kind of resumption of a military government in Cairo.
The relationship is going well. It's technically sound. They're cooperating on the military side. So it's sort of back to normal, if that would be called normal.
But one important factor has changed. After years of plentiful gas, Egypt is now in the throes of genuine gas shortages.
Egypt's desperate. There's queues outside petrol stations. Almost every night there's a blackout. You never know when it's going to be. The economy is struggling, people are struggling, people are furious.
What's happening now in 2014 is happening for real. It's not fabricated anymore. Egypt is really suffering now a dramatic shortage of energy resources.
Meanwhile, a staggering find has been made in the Mediterranean. In 2010, Israel laid claim to deep water fields that hold up to 26 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. Called Leviathan and Tamar, these huge discoveries are the largest of their kind this century.
If you talk to the Israelis now, they are self-congratulating each other, and when gas came on stream, they called that their second liberation day. And once Leviathan comes on stream, with the possibility of exporting gas to Egypt, the implications for Israel will be tremendous.
Suddenly, right next door, the Israeli state has more gas than it needs. Suddenly, the Israeli state is saying, yeah, we've got some gas. Do you want to buy it? You have to pay a lot more than what we paid you.
Right now, Egypt needs gas. We are in close proximity. From the technical point of view, it will take very short time to have a flow of natural gas to Egypt.
After the coup, Sisi began to arrange the deal that could secure his political future. The regime made secret approaches to Tel Aviv.
Since the overthrow of Mohamed Morsi, contacts have resumed between the two governments. There have been several meetings, mainly from the Egyptian side. The Egyptians are very interested, very curious to know how much the Israeli government would stand up to such deal, ensure the flow of gas.
The company that has been operating the rigs and leading Israel's exploration in the Mediterranean is the Texas-based Noble Energy. They refused our request for an interview and would not discuss gas sales to Egypt. We also tracked down Egypt's top diplomat in Israel, Mustafa Cooney, but he too refused to meet with us. Israelis tell us that Egypt is keeping its approaches clandestine because the regime in Cairo needs to buy time.
What they want to do is establish themselves from the domestic point of view, gain political support, and then go into economic ventures with Israel.
In January 2014, Sisi put the first part of his plan in place. The Reuters news agency noted that the Egyptian government had quietly lifted restrictions on private oil and gas companies operating in Egypt. For the first time in the country's history, companies can now import gas from any foreign energy provider. 4 months later, Noble Energy announced a letter of intent with the Spanish firm Union Fenosa to supply natural gas from offshore Israel to its gas liquefaction facilities in Egypt.
Noble Energy have examined the notion of selling the gas to Egypt. It can either be used domestically in Egypt, or it can go to the LNG plants on the Nile Delta, one of which is closed down because of lack of gas, and the other which is running at only partial capacity.
The two liquefied natural gas, or LNG plants on Egypt's coast at Idku and Damietta are key to Egypt's proposed deal with Israel. One is run by the Spanish Union Fenosa, which is also suing Egypt for $6 billion. LNG is a method of freezing gas until it becomes a liquid. It can then be transported by tanker rather than pipeline and sold in far greater volume.
The plants are already built. They were built at a time when cost of building LNG plants was low, and they're not functioning at the moment because there is not enough gas for exports in Egypt.
Today, nearly all of Egypt's gas is being diverted for domestic use due to the severe shortages. In doing so, the government has breached export obligations to powerful energy companies.
Each of the two companies which run the LNG facilities lose revenues in billions of US dollars just by not being able to export the gas that they have committed themselves to export according to the contracts that they have. Egyptians are interested in enabling Israeli gas to go from the natural gas fields offshore Israel straight to the LNG facilities in Egypt.
Israel has made it clear that any commercial deal with Egypt needed more than just access to Egypt's LNG plants. It also wanted a commitment that the Suez Canal would always be accessible to ships carrying its gas to Israel's most lucrative markets in Asia.
The changing government in Egypt has meant that Israel can reconsider the option of converting some of its gas into LNG in the Mediterranean and then shipping that gas via tanker through the Suez Canal to destinations in Asia. Under the Morsi government, there was no confidence that Egypt would allow such shipments to go through the Suez Canal. The changing government has meant that this potential can be re-examined.
If we can get into an agreement with Egypt, between the companies, but supplying gas to Egypt, this will also cement the relations political and economic between Israel and Egypt.
The Israelis would love to make Egypt dependent on them. That would fit them perfectly power-wise. And that also offers a revenue-creating mechanism for the Israeli state, and possibly again for Meyman and Hossein Salem.
One option for delivering Israeli gas to Egypt's LNG plants is to lay new pipelines from Israel's gas fields. But the quickest and cheapest method is to reverse the pumps on the EMG pipeline from Israel's gas terminal at Ashkelon and then deliver it over land.
We've already got a pipeline running from Egypt to the Israeli state, from Arish to Ashkelon. You could reverse that, it's quite simple, won't even cost very much money, and send the gas the other way. The Israelis could put the gas in and it could come out in Arish and be distributed into the Egyptian network.
We discovered a clue to the deal EMG is hoping to make with the Egyptian government. It's buried in a bankruptcy filing from Yossi Meyman's holding company in the United States. A footnote reveals that shareholders are considering using EMG's pipeline to transport natural gas from Israel to Egypt so that it can be converted into LNG or used locally in Egypt. And EMG holds a powerful bargaining chip, an $8 billion lawsuit against the Egyptian government.
Why you're suing the government of Egypt, and if you're using economic duress to have them buy Israeli gas. Is that the case?
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Have a good day.
Are you working with the Israeli government to reverse the directional flow of the EMG pipeline so that Israeli gas can be sold to the Egyptians?
I appreciate your insistence. I can tell
While evasive, Meyman appeared reassured.
Are you working with the Israeli government?
Thank you.
Are you working with the Egyptian government?
Thank you, gentlemen.
The Egyptian government has various ways out. Now, they could just stand up and say, enough, we've been ripped off enough. The Egyptian people don't deserve to pay out anymore. But facing pressure, facing court cases in legal spaces where they have almost no control, they're going to look for an option that doesn't involve just standing up to outside power, that seems like more of a compromise that lets Hossein Salem and Meyman keep making a lot of money.
In Cairo, the former oil minister Sami Fahmy was released from custody pending a retrial which is yet to happen. Hossein Salem is expected to return to Egypt with the charges against him dropped. The hidden story of Egypt's energy industry is back on track.
They didn't lose everything when Morsi came on board. The military sustained its relation. We still had the people we were talking to. The Israelis had the people they were talking to. It was all going on while Morsi was in power. He hadn't been there long enough to really change the structure that much. So you had the same people or their replacements in place with the same basic interests involved.
I will not answer.
Will you answer to the judges?
Yes, I will.
When are you going to answer to the judges?
When they call me.
We'd be happy to come in and have an interview if you'd invite us. Are we welcome? Any message to the Egyptian people?
Israel will be the only one that will end up stronger out of this, and all the Arab people around will end up much more weaker.
It's basically saying to the Israelis, look, you want to screw us? Here's a tool you can use to screw us. If you want to turn off our gas because you want to put pressure on us, here, you can do it. If you want to stop our economy, here's the tool to do it.
The Egyptian public can make a calculation that it's happier to have electricity 24 hours a day because they deal with Israel and getting natural gas, or they would prefer to be in the dark for some hours a day as a matter of principle.